Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
In the last 3 episodes, we covered the background and history of the Hirschfield case up to the trial and the verdict. Today we conclude with the sentencing phase, the reactions to the sentence, the impact on the victims' families, and final thoughts from Dawn and Ron. Let's talk about the sentencing phase.
So the sentencing phase, we took a break, and the sentencing phase came next. And that was in large part due to a lot of the investigation that Ron did into Richard Hirschfield's background. Those same prior offenses came in at the penalty phase. And now the rules of evidence allow more information about Richard Hirschfield's past to come in.
I mentioned he had a bad childhood and there was sexual abuse that he saw and was probably victimized by, and a lot of this comes up, but you dig around and you don't have to continue with that behavior. Joseph hadn't really, there were some allegations, but he was never charged with anything. But you've got Richard being convicted twice, once for rape, one for child molest. Then you find out about he was molesting his girlfriend's son for several years. That poor kid was just ruined. I mean, he became a heroin addict. It's just a life lost, and he's still alive. And there were other kids. We get you some of the information we found was in Hirschfield's jail cell. Some of these writings he had, just sick about molesting younger kids and 9 and 10-year-olds and talking about them. And it's just like, we're able to find this. Luckily, Dawn's able to get a lot of it in. But, your penalty phase is almost, if you're watching this or if you're in a jury, almost more grotesque, if you will, because you're seeing who the guy really is, because a lot of that stuff comes in. And, of course, the defense is trying to say, well, listen, he was a poor kid. He had this going on. He saw this. His dad was a horrible human being. And it's like, yes, and yes, but he was one of, 4 or 5 or 6 kids. He's the only one that went down this path. So, we're just presenting all the evidence we can to them. I will say, I want to backtrack quickly. Dawn talked about her closing argument, and it was really good. I didn't get to see much of the trial, but I did get to see that. And you said it's emotional. I don't know if she would say it's emotional or not, but you could definitely feel it. I don't get, and I've been working on murder since '95, but the investigators usually don't get as close to the families. And Dawn was with the families, both families, for years. And I don't think I could have even spoken in complete sentences and be as artful as she was with the closing argument as she was, just because these people are in the audience looking back at you and you're just going, I'm no Meryl Streep, but you're trying to convince everybody of the pain that these folks have been and lived with. And she did a fantastic job. And she also did a great job of getting the points across of her case and why this had to be the guy. So I think 3 hours for the jury is almost what would be expected, because she did a great job. But I think she's to be commended. I would have cracked having to be with victims' families for that many years. I'm not built that way.
Thanks, Ron.
So speaking about the victims' families, they did make victim impact statements, and that was part of the sentencing phase.
They did, and it's hard because I remember getting so upset during litigating motions at the penalty phase because we were having to nitpick over which childhood photo could come in and whether this one was too sweet or this one was too emotional or this one was too empathetic because he's with Santa, or this one of Sabrina on a horse evoked too much emotion. And it was the first, this is the part of the trial, it's the first time the jury really gets to know who these kids are and what the loss was. And in preparing the penalty phase, you have to narrow what you're going to, it's still an evidence portion of the trial, so you still have to narrow what you're going to be offering into evidence. So we had to go through these impact statements, and I had to hear the defense object to, well, the father saying this is too graphic and too heartbreaking. Well, that's the truth. That's what happened. So I had to narrow who testified. I had to narrow what they were going to be asked so it was not duplicating other witnesses. And then I had to narrow the amount of photographs I could use from boxes of photo albums the family brought me and their memories, and really trying to synthesize who these kids were in a short presentation of evidence to a jury in a courtroom was hard because I had come to know these people so well.
I didn't know that the victim impact statements were subject to review by the defense.
So they're not impact statements. That's different. Okay. What happens after sentencing is the impact statement. When we're in evidence at the penalty phase, they're actually testifying witnesses. So you have to do it in a question-answer format. So, Dr. Riggins, how did you feel when this happened? Mrs. Riggins, tell me about your son. That kind of thing. So I had to break down who I was going to ask what and what areas I was going to cover with them when these, all of them would have talked for hours. And we just couldn't do that. But it was so incredibly heartbreaking to hear these adults break down and talk about what had happened. The time that passed, Sabrina's dad had gotten Alzheimer's disease in the process. And at the beginning, when I got the case, this strong man telling me, you go get him, and I'm so glad you have this case. And the man who came to closing argument, who wasn't quite sure why he was there and couldn't testify because of the disease, was just heartbreaking because he lived for this day to see the man accountable for his daughter's death. And so his wife testified, Mrs. Riggins testified. Dr. Riggins described how knowing the way these kids died was so brutal. Medically, he understood, and the evidence came in, that they were alive when their throats were slit and they had choked on and suffocated on their own blood. And he understood physiologically what that meant. And to see this very educated, strong man describe tearfully how he knew how his last moments of his son's life were, to hear Kim Gonsalves talk about the last moments of her daughter, to hear the siblings talk about their loss, the community loss, all of that was important as part of the penalty phase. And that is hard to dispassionately put on into evidence, but you have to in order to get through it. The defense case at the penalty phase then became, he's an abused child. His mother was raped. He had these horrible things happen in his past. He has a brain disorder. It was the, chicken egg. This, what's wrong with his amygdala makes him a violent person, or is he's a violent person and look, you can see it in his brain. There were all of these theories about his brain being damaged, about him being abused, but this was also a kid who went to private school. He was very smart. There were friends who testified that they thought that he would either be the director of NASA or a notorious criminal, and he chose the latter.
This was the first time that I was asked to do any interviews for a penalty phase. We don't have a ton, or very few, I don't know if we have one a year, of capital cases that are death penalty cases. And the work that you do as an investigator on the back end is somewhat different, because although it was easy for me to go talk to a lot of witnesses that had been victimized by Hirschfield, which I'm familiar with, I wasn't familiar with talking to family members. And that was difficult. And that's when you get a much better picture of what Don knew all along in dealing with the families of how great these two kids were. I was telling Don yesterday, I remember just looking at it, and I kind of just felt really, really inferior, because I started college in 1980 just like these two, but I went to a JC. Both of these kids were super, super smart, and the Riggins boy was a good athlete, good-looking, red-headed kid like Opie. And Sabrina was a attractive girl. And then when you talk about what was actually lost, and you can never quantify that, but Mr. Riggins was an orthopedic surgeon. The son was likely going to follow in his footsteps. He wanted to go into, a field of really what he was describing as incorporating robotics to some degree for limbs, for amputees. So what was lost there? And he had a great mind. And I'm sure as science has evolved and mechanics have evolved, we're living all that stuff now. And she wanted to work with, underprivileged kids, or that was sad to me, what was lost. And it's just like, man, these guys had a lot going, and what society lost. I think that's the saddest part, is what society lost, because they'd be my age now. They'd be 56, and they would have had kids in college and stuff. That was the saddest part.
What was the result of the sentencing phase?
Again, the jury was stellar in this case. There was a big plea by the defense for mercy, for pity. There's a number of things that they argue against death. And it's a big thing to ask of a person who came in to jury duty thinking they might be on a DUI or maybe hear about a robbery, that now you're being asked to sit in a trial for months on end and at the end make a decision to agree that a man's life should be taken. And to sign off on that is a hard thing to do. This jury made that call again in about 3 hours.
The court process then is done. What did the victims, John and Sabrina's families, how did they feel after that court process is done, and how has this impacted them then, and from what you know about them moving forward?
They have been so, again, relieved. They feel, and I think they all felt strongly, that no matter what happens to Richard Hirschfield, that he received the death penalty was very important to them. And they are really just stellar families. Andrea and her then boyfriend, Steve, are still married. Therese and her then husband are still married. The Gonsalves parents, Kim and George, are married. Richard and Kate are still married. Their families are forever entwined because of the way their children were killed, but they've also all gone on to kind of face this and in different ways, but they're just amazing people. Sabrina's sister Andrea went on to adopt several children. She said they were the children that her sister never got to have. Therese does a lot of humanitarian work, and she's an artist. The Riggins family kind of became advocates. They were relieved and happy by this verdict because they felt like it was the right thing to bring justice for the death of their children. And to know that Richard Hirschfield would never see a day out of custody in his lifetime meant a lot to them. The Riggins have helped a lot with death penalty reform. They've been resources and advocates. They've all reached out and been helpful to other victims and to law enforcement community. They've really handled this in a way that is exceptional. And they're people that I consider like family at this point in my life. I lived through this case with them. The Gonsalves family is originally from Hawaii, which is where I grew up, and I've visited them there. I've seen Sabrina's grave at Punch Bowl. I am in constant contact with Andrea. I've received a painting from Therese that's just incredible and beautiful about the giving tree and a little boy under a tree in the moonlight. And they're just amazing people. And I think they've handled an incredible tragedy better than I could ever have, and I think most people could ever have.
I think you've both expressed how this case has impacted you professionally and personally. It sounds like this is a case that will stay with you, that you will.
Absolutely. The case will stay with me, but I try and leave the Hirschfield part behind. Right now, looking forward, these people have been a part of my life. They knew me when I was single, engaged, got married, and I actually got pregnant with my son during this trial. And so these people are a part of me, and I choose to look at all that they've accomplished and done and who they are and all I've learned from them than focusing on the evil that he brought into their life.
I will only say that I think what I took away from it is investigatively is that it's just a ton of work, number one. It covers areas that you usually don't get into, and I actually am finding, as we've talked just today, almost similarities with cases that I work on now with these guys that are cold cases, and they go back and it's just a long time, and I don't think about Hirschfield very much, but he was a horrible guy, and I'm just glad it's over with.
And justice delayed is still justice. The fact that it took so long is a tragedy. The fact that he was able to be out of custody as long as he was before the crime was solved is horrific. But it still, in the end, was worth every minute, hour, day, weekend, holiday of work to bring justice to this case, to these families, and to the community that was so impacted by these crimes, because it really shattered Davis. Was this innocent college town who didn't have crimes like this happen. And then all of a sudden, their two stellar standout students are gone in this horrible way. So even though the passage of time was hard for everyone, the justice in the end is what matters.
And I think what you said, justice delayed is still justice served, goes for all the cold cases.
Absolutely.
That have been solved and that are still yet to be solved. So I think that's a great place to end this podcast series. I want to thank Dawn and Ron for your insight and a personal perspective into having worked on this case.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Join us for our next episode, where we will talk about the District Attorney's Crime Lab and Forensic Science with Chip Pollock, the lab director.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.